My name is Lieutenant Colonel Kate Mercer. I am 42 years old. I have been a signals intelligence officer for 18 years, and on a Monday morning in September, I reported to Fort Haddon as the first female officer assigned to the 14th Signals Unit in 20 years. The commanding officer, Colonel Bernard Walsh, welcomed me with a formal briefing that included the unit's history, its operational record, and its traditions. The tradition he described last had been running for 20 years. Every year, on the 14th of October, the unit held what they called the Vance Remembrance, a brief ceremony, a reading, a moment of acknowledgement for Captain Eleanor Vance, who had been the unit's first female officer 2 decades ago, and whose brief service they honored annually. Colonel Walsh said, "We take the Vance Remembrance seriously. Captain Vance set a standard. As the first female officer to join us in 20 years, you carry something of that forward." He said it with genuine warmth. He believed what he was saying. I thanked him. I went to my new office, and I looked up Eleanor Vance.
Let me tell you why I looked her up. Not because I doubted the tradition, not because I had any reason to suspect anything. I looked her up because she was being presented to me as a template, as a standard I was expected to carry forward, and I have spent 18 years not accepting templates without reading the source material. That is not suspicion. That is how I work. I opened the unit's digital archive on my first afternoon and I searched for Captain Eleanor Vance. The official record was brief. She had joined the unit 20 years ago, she had served for 2 years, she had left to pursue other opportunities. The record was 3 sentences. 3 sentences for the person the unit held a ceremony for every year. I noted that. I kept reading. The object at the center of everything was a file, not a digital file, archival, the kind that exists in the lower drawers of storage systems in military records facilities because it predates the digital migration and has never been retrospectively entered. I found it because of Corporal Theo Nash. Theo had been with the unit for 4 years. He processed administrative records. On my 3rd day, he came to my office with what he described as routine onboarding documentation, and then, as he was leaving, he paused at the door. He said, "Ma'am, if you're interested in the unit's history, the full history, there's a physical records room in Building C that doesn't come up in the digital system. Some of the older files are only there." He said it carefully, in the way of someone who has been waiting for the right person to say something to. I said, "Thank you, Corporal Nash." He left. I went to Building C that afternoon.
The physical records room. Shelves. Banker's boxes. Files organized by year. Dusty in the way of things that have not been opened often. I found the 14th Signals Unit files for the relevant years. I found Eleanor Vance's complete file. It was not 3 sentences. It was 47 pages. The 47 pages, I will give you the shape of it. Eleanor Vance had joined the unit 22 years ago. She had served for 2 years with a record that the file's internal assessments described as outstanding. She had been, by every measure in those assessments, an exceptional officer. In her 2nd year, she had submitted a formal complaint. The complaint was against her commanding officer at the time, Brigadier General Harold Cross, who had since retired with full honors. The complaint detailed a pattern of conduct over 14 months, decisions that had excluded her from operational briefings she was qualified for, assessments of her work that did not reflect the internal evaluations in her file, a series of incidents in which her authority had been undermined in front of junior officers. The complaint had been reviewed by an independent panel. The panel had found the complaint substantially credible. Cross had retained his position. 3 months after the panel's finding, Eleanor had been offered a lateral transfer to a different posting. She had declined. 2 months after declining the transfer, she had been dismissed. The grounds cited in the dismissal were conduct-related. The file contained her response to those grounds, a 14-page rebuttal, precise and documented, and entirely consistent with every performance assessment that had preceded it. The dismissal had been upheld. Eleanor Vance had left the unit, left the Army, and the record had been sealed. 3 months after her dismissal, Harold Cross had established the Vance Remembrance.
I sat in the physical records room for a long time. The Vance Remembrance had been running for 20 years. 20 years of an annual ceremony honoring a woman who had been dismissed after filing a credible complaint against the man who created the ceremony. 20 years of her name read aloud in a unit that had erased her actual story and replaced it with 3 sentences about a woman who had left to pursue other opportunities. 20 years of the institution presenting itself as one that honors women. I had been brought here as the living continuation of that presentation, the first female officer in 20 years. Carry something of that forward. I put the file back on the shelf. I photographed every page, and I went to find Colonel Walsh. I want to pause here, because standing in a dusty records room holding 47 pages that told a completely different story from the ceremony being held in her name is the moment this story became something I had not walked into Fort Haddon expecting to find. If you have ever discovered that the story you were asked to be part of was not the story you had been told, drop a comment below and subscribe right now, because what I did with those 47 pages and what happened to the Vance Remembrance is the part that I knew I could not leave undone. Colonel Walsh. I went to his office at 1700 on Thursday, 4 days after I arrived. I had spent those 4 days reading the file 3 times, researching Eleanor Vance through every channel available to me, and speaking to Dr. Patricia Shaw, a military historian at the Associated Research Institution, who had spent 12 years working on institutional gender histories. Dr. Shaw had known about Eleanor Vance. Not everything. The sealed file was not something she had accessed, but enough. References in other documents that pointed towards something that had never been fully examined. She said, "If you have what you're describing, this is significant." I went to Walsh at 1700. I placed the photographs of the 47 pages on his desk. I gave him 40 minutes to read. He read them in 35. When he looked up, his face had the look of a man who has just understood that something he believed in was built on a foundation he had not examined. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't know." I said, "I believe you." He said, "What do you want to do with this?" I said, "I want to do what should have been done 20 years ago. I want her record corrected. I want the dismissal reviewed. And I want the Vance Remembrance to tell the truth about who Eleanor Vance was and what she actually did." The process. A formal request for historical record review was submitted to the Military Records Authority in October. Dr. Shaw provided supporting documentation from her own research. The sealed file was officially accessed and reviewed for the first time since Eleanor's dismissal. The review took 4 months. Its findings. The dismissal grounds had been inadequately substantiated. The conduct cited did not meet the threshold required and was inconsistent with Eleanor's documented performance record. The dismissal was found to have been procedurally flawed. Eleanor Vance's record was corrected. A formal notation was added, the first official acknowledgement that her complaint against Cross had been found credible and that the dismissal had not been properly grounded.
Harold Cross had died 6 years ago. There were no criminal proceedings. The notation went into the institutional record without a living respondent. That is not everything justice looks like, but it is something. Eleanor Vance herself. Dr. Shaw helped me find her. She was 61 years old. She had left the Army and had built a career in telecommunications engineering. She had been married for 16 years. She had 2 adult children. She had not spoken publicly about what had happened. She had not, as far as Dr. Shaw could determine, spoken about it much at all. I wrote her a letter. 3 pages. I told her who I was and what I had found and what the review had concluded. I told her that her record had been corrected. I told her that the Vance Remembrance was going to change. She replied within 10 days. Her letter was 1 page. She said she had spent 20 years not thinking about it, because thinking about it had cost her too much. She said the record correction was something she had stopped believing would happen. She said she was glad it had happened before she was too old to feel it properly. She said, "Tell them the real story. That's all I ever wanted." The 14th of October. The Vance Remembrance that year was different. Colonel Walsh had worked with me and with Dr. Shaw to rewrite the reading. The ceremony was the same, brief, formal, a moment of acknowledgement, but the words were different. The words told the truth. They told about the complaint, about the finding, about the dismissal, about the sealed file, about the woman who had done everything right and had been removed for it, and whose name had been carried forward in a story that was not hers. The unit stood and listened. Some of them had known the ceremony for years. None of them had known this version. Eleanor Vance was not in the room. She had been invited. She had declined, politely, with a single line that said she preferred to let the institution reckon with its own record without being present for the reckoning. That was her right. I read the words Colonel Walsh had approved. My voice was steady.
The file. The 47 pages are in the official archive now, no longer in the lower drawer of a shelf in a dusty room in Building C. In the official digital record, properly catalogued, accessible. Beside it is the record correction notation. Beside that is a copy of Eleanor Vance's letter. Tell them the real story. That is what the file says now. That is what the ceremony says now. 20 years late, but said. Here is what the 47 pages in a dusty records room taught me. The traditions we are asked to uphold carry the stories we are given about them. Read the source material. Not because every tradition is a lie, most are not, most carry something real and worth continuing. But some carry a version of events that was constructed to serve the institution rather than to honor the person. And when you find that, when you find the 47 pages that tell a different story than the 3 sentences in the official record, you have a choice about what to do with them. I was brought to Fort Haddon as the living continuation of a presentation the institution was making about itself. I became, instead, the person who made the presentation true. Not by being the first woman in 20 years, by making sure the first woman's actual story was finally told. That is the only tradition worth carrying forward. Drop a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And subscribe. I am here every week with a new story. She read the file. She found the woman. She made sure the record said what it should have said 20 years ago.